Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's RCPath Book Club. I'm Angharad Davis, and I'm Vice President for Learning at the Royal College of Pathologists and a medical microbiologist by background. As you may already know, it's National Pathology Week this week, and this year is particularly special because we're also celebrating the college's Diamond Jubilee. Our theme for National Pathology Week 2022 is Pathology, Past, Present and Future. And tonight we'll be exploring the past, present and future of vaccine misinformation and hesitancy. So our book tonight is Stuck. It's a bit difficult to show it with the blurred background, but it is Stuck, How Vaccine Rumours Start and Why They Don't Go Away, which was published in 2020, but of course vaccine hesitancy isn't a new phenomenon, and widespread smallpox vaccination began in the early 1800s following Edward Jenner's cowpox experiments, in which he famously showed he could protect a child from smallpox if he infected them with fluid from a cowpox blister. And Jenner's ideas, of course, were very novel for his time, and they were met with immediate public criticism and induced a lot of fear and protest, with objections ranging from the sanitary to the religious, scientific and political. And Stuck explores the complex blend of factors that contribute to the creation, spread and persistence of vaccine rumours, with using examples such as MMR, hepatitis B, human papillomavirus or HPV vaccines and tetanus vaccines, to name a few. Now, we're delighted to be joined tonight by the author of Stuck, who is Professor Heidi J. Larson. Heidi is the founding director of the Vaccine Confidence Project and Professor of Anthropology, Risk and Decision Science at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Her current research is particularly focused on issues around public cooperation during emergencies, such as disease outbreaks, natural disasters, terrorism and conflict. As well as writing Stuck, Heidi has published widely on the drivers and enablers of vaccine confidence. In 2021, she was awarded the Edinburgh Medal, and in the same year, the BBC named Heidi as one of the 100 most influential women in the world. Welcome to RCPath Book Club, Heidi, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. In addition, we're very lucky that we're also joined by a panel of other experts to discuss some of the ideas in the book, and I'm now going to invite them to introduce themselves to you, going in alphabetical surname order. So we start with Helen Donovan.
Just to unmute myself, sorry. Helen Donovan, I'm the professional lead for public health nursing at the Royal College of Nursing, and I'm an immunisation specialist nurse.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us. Next, Professor Will Irving.
Hello there. I'm a clinical academic virologist, and I'm based at the University of Nottingham.
Thank you, and Professor Will Jennings.
I'm Will Jennings. I'm Professor of Political Science, Public Policy at the University of Southampton, and I'm Principal Investigator of the TrustGov project, which is funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And then Suze Kundu.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Suze Kundu. I'm Head of Public Engagement at the technology company Digital Science, but before that I was a nanochemist, and so I've navigated my fair share of PR and misconceptions in my time as well. So as a science communicator and an engager with the public on research, I'm really excited to be joining this panel.
Thank you for joining us tonight. So the format tonight will be a reading from the book by Heidi, followed by an approximately half-hour discussion with the panel, and then we will take Q&As from the audience for the last 10 or 15 minutes of the session. The event is being recorded and will be made available on the RCPath YouTube channel in due course. If you'd like to, please do tweet about the event if you're on Twitter, tagging @RCPath and with the hashtags RCPath Book Club, Pathology Week and RCPath 60. If you do have questions for the panelists, please post them in the Q&A area of the Zoom webinar, which you can find on your Zoom toolbar. And we will put a selection of these questions to the author and panel after the discussion. So, Heidi, could I invite you to start by reading your chosen excerpts from Stuck?
Thanks. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And let's see, I'll give it a go. I wasn't sure exactly what would be the best parts, but I picked a few that I thought tried to highlight some of the points and the thoughts in the book. It was winter in India. I was sitting in a holy cow and Krishna adorned taxi in New Delhi. I was driving to meet colleagues working in the Ministry of Health. We were stuck in traffic with a cacophony of impatient horns sounding in the background. The polluted smog was thick, so taking a deep breath to stay calm was an option. I looked out the window, a movie in itself, and found a moment of wisdom, one of those moments India is famous for. It was a half-bent sign at the side of the road in big red letters on a once white background, and it announced, "You are not stuck in traffic, you are traffic." That moment and that mantra has stayed with me ever since. I really thought about it a lot. It helped me navigate and understand the situation we find ourselves in as individuals and as societies, not surrounded by, but creators of our own stuckness. The difference in perspective, in language, and in experience that defines the tensions between scientists and non-scientists, between those observing the traffic, counting the cars, studying the patterns, and informing the rules, and those caught in the traffic, frustrated, caught in the herd and feeling voiceless, is an allegory of the dynamics which are driving global networks of vaccine dissent. Emotions are rising, while medical and scientific powers somehow expect the old rules and hierarchies to hold their ground, hoping that publics will finally come to their senses and that a few disease outbreaks will motivate them to line up for vaccinations. This was written before COVID. New rules of engagement are being decided outside of esteemed institutions. New relationships are being established, and new notions of evidence are taking hold. Vaccines sit on the cusp of these transformations, embedded in government processes, produced by big business, innovated by scientific discovery, and navigating the wonders as well as the consequences of a digital revolution that has supported and disrupted local and global politics and touched almost every human life on the planet. The vaccine enterprise, from discovery to delivery, cannot escape all the turbulence which surrounds it. While the scientific community ponders how to navigate this new relationship, the public has already moved on, doing their own research, finding their own evidence, with Google and social media at their fingertips and growing networks of like-minded people reinforcing their beliefs and anxieties. I'm just going to read you an example of one of the young women who I found very poignant in some of the challenges or the new evidence taking place. Kate is 33 years old, and she was pregnant and trying to decide whether she should get vaccinated. I looked a bit online about risks and stuff. I don't really think I looked at the risk of the disease. Probably should have. We kind of felt nature must have done something right. There must be an inbuilt immunity that will develop over time and hopefully protect her, meaning her baby. And well, it's not a decision that we made lightly. We might regret it in a few years' time, and we felt, well, either way, if something happened to her, we would regret whatever decision we made. waning vaccine confidence, skepticism about safety, and even the need for vaccines, and an overall tectonic shift away from trusting experts to having more confidence in the opinions and evidence shared in stories circulating among neighbors, friends, colleagues, and online social networks, speak to a near reversal of the Age of Enlightenment. 300 years ago, science was championed as freedom, freedom from religious dogma. Today, science is perceived as the new dogma.
Thanks, Heidi. I think that gives a really excellent flavour of the themes of this book and the kinds of issues that are discussed within it. What drove you to write this book in the first place?
Well, I was working with UNICEF at the time and working on the launch of Gavi, and I was leading the communication strategies for the introduction of new vaccines in our global program. And I just saw a trend. I did a lot of country visits around these new vaccines, and I heard more and more questioning about vaccines in ways that UNICEF was not particularly familiar with or normally. We did have some issues in the polio eradication program, and it was during that time also that the boycott in northern Nigeria happened, which was an 11-month boycott just because of a rumor. There was no adverse event. There was no, it was just really an anxiety-driven and politically propagated, but it went around the world. I mean, it caused the virus to go around the world and infect 20 odd countries and cost the polio program a lot of hundreds of millions of dollars to repair the lost time. And as we know, polio is still not fully eradicated. So I felt like we needed to understand better what the roots of all these emerging concerns are. And I left UNICEF and set up this research group to start to map and investigate this. And the book really captures a lot of what we've been hearing from our both quantitative and qualitative work over the last 12 years.
So you mentioned the rumours there in Nigeria in that answer, and you talk throughout the book about vaccine rumours and how they arise due to interplay between lots of various factors. And I love the way that you described rumours as being like an ecosystem, not unlike a microbiome. As a microbiologist, I love that analogy and the ecology of rumour. So why do rumours start, and what factors are commonly overlooked when we're thinking about how vaccine rumours start?
Well, I think in general, I mean, rumors are by definition a piece of unverified information. They're not necessarily wrong, but they're incomplete, unverified. And it's particularly in times where there's uncertainty and not a lot of information, and people try to make sense of things that don't make sense or that they don't have information. And so people conjecture, and then one starts thinking, well, it could be this, it could be that, and then a few others come in, and it becomes then if there's no alternative story that comes up that counters it and it seems plausible, it builds a following. And sometimes these issues come up and then they sleep and they wait for another opportunity. And that's the gardening microbiome thing. And it's one of the reasons I don't think just fact checking and is going to fix this. Well, we need to look at the roots.
Thank you. Now, in the prologue of the book, you mentioned that 2 days after the book went into production, the World Health Organization declared that the novel coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan in China was a public health emergency of international concern. And of course, since then, there's been lots of information has been circulated, but also, as we know, lots of misinformation throughout the pandemic. And you've already touched on rumours, and you actually have a whole chapter on rumours in your book. And I wondered whether you and also Will Irving, as a virologist, do you find that these rumours tend to be vaccine specific? And were there parallels to draw between the examples mentioned in Stuck and the rumours that we've heard about during COVID-19? Shall we start with Heidi and then Will?
Sure. Well, yeah, a lot of them, I mean, the rumors, there are rumors specifically about vaccines, but what drives them is not necessarily about the vaccine. And people will have an anxiety about, whether they should take it or not, but it's because it could be politics, it could be an alternative belief. There's a whole mix of reasons. It could be a scare. They heard something that made them frightened, or they didn't know enough. And some of the principles about all this are absolutely true for COVID, and certainly the absolute uncertainty and constantly changing information around COVID makes it fertile ground, exceptionally fertile ground for rumors where people are trying to make sense of things. We've seen extremes too, where people outrightly refuse that COVID even exists. Which we heard in the beginning of Ebola and HIV. So it's not unique to COVID, but it is one type of reaction.
So I think it's really interesting that you submitted the text of the book for publishing 2 days before COVID was announced. My impression is in the last 2 years is that we've had huge success in developing very novel approaches to vaccines in a very short space of time, and validating and testing the safety of those vaccines under pressure in a very short space of time. So my perception is that we've done quite well with COVID vaccines, but I wondered, are there parts of the world where this is not true? And what kinds of rumors have come out specifically related to the new COVID vaccines?
Well, the anxieties about vaccines, certainly, I mean, in COVID, a strong theme was how quickly, oh, wait a minute, we didn't even know this virus existed, and all of a sudden you have a vaccine. That's a bit suspicious for many. Frankly, I think a lot of people didn't even know how long it takes to make a vaccine. All of a sudden, they all know that it was 10, 15, it can take a long time. And 40 years later, we still don't have an HIV vaccine. So what's going on here? I think as a scientific community, we weren't quick. We could have use that opportunity to talk about the reasons it was so quick. We had exceptional amounts of investment. We had some of the typical processes kind of shortened, not in terms of the safety part, but just we had new technology. We were able to isolate and understand. We could have turned this around to be to tell the story of why it was so quick. And it's easier to say these things in retrospect, and it was kind of announced by press release instead of through, and that also kind of caught, I think, a number of people off guard. And the fact that it was like great news, 95%, and this immediate, this is going to fix it. And then, who would have thought that 2.5 years later, and the journey between then and now. So I think that that quickness was definitely an anxiety, but how well we did with vaccines really depends on where you live. I mean, as you know, a lot of parts of the world, particularly Africa, don't even have vaccines available. And we work closely with Africa CDC and monitoring. And the reality is, in this late 2020, when we did the first survey, on willingness to take a COVID vaccine, it was really optimistic. I mean, more so than I expected, even about how willing, including in Nigeria, that had a history of skepticism. But we saw that the longer they weren't getting them, that optimism was dropping. They started hearing about the the side effects, particularly in Europe, different countries, stopping or stalling, or and it just eroded some confidence. In other places, things went well. Other people that had an immediate experience of COVID, so it was an incredibly varied, fractured picture.
Mm. So you give a very wide range of examples of myths, if I can call them that, about adverse events arising from vaccines, and some of them repeat themselves with different vaccines. Fears of inducing infertility or sterility. The one that I found really fascinating was the mass psychogenic illnesses that seem to arise in different countries at different times. And it goes back to what Angarad was asking, is how does that arise? Because a rumor is not, it's a bit like if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, did it really happen? If someone has an idea, it's not a rumor until it's been passed around a bit. So how do you think this kind of response was generated? It's such a bizarre reaction. I struggle to understand it.
Well, it happened partly thanks to social media. And it also happened because, well, the initial, in terms of these reactions, the nausea, the shaking, the paralysis, mobility, pain, chronic pain, that was happening with this very small group of girls in Japan, and most of which resolved within 24 hours, 48 hours. But there were a few that it persisted, and a very quickly organized, very influential mothers who organized a very aggressive anti-campaign that kind of paralyzed the program. And it was almost 9 years before they resumed it. But in the meanwhile, part of their savvy campaign was to do YouTube videos of the girls in their various reactions. That went viral. And the doctor who characterized this syndrome, I think they called it HANS, HPV, affected neurological syndrome, gave it a name, met another doctor from Denmark at a conference in Russia where they were comparing notes on these symptoms. And so there was this scientific kind of discussion going on. And then this YouTube video started traveling. And then in Denmark, a group of girls, the same thing, a TV documentary with these girls, the vaccinated girls. Ireland, it had and then Colombia. We had seen in our global media monitoring, social media monitoring, I saw a YouTube video screenshot of the Japanese girls that was voiceover in English and the subtitles in Spanish. I said, this is a risk. But then I thought, I don't want to create any panic. Let's keep an eye on this. But it was so quick. There was like 500 girls across multiple schools in Colombia. So it was really mediated by, and there's now more research on the fact that you don't need to be in the same room and be provoked. I mean, sometimes these things happen like dominoes, where one girl faints and then 4 others in line faint, waiting for their vaccine. You don't have to be in the same room. You can be halfway around the world, and that anxiety triggers. What we have seen is that it's like the particular state where it happened in Colombia, or the area had a lot of conflict, a lot of sexual abuse. It wasn't in other parts of the country. So there's a lot of things we've learned. And as I mentioned in the book, I've been in discussion with the Advisory Committee on Safety with WHO from my UNICEF years about we need to not just be looking at the safety of the product, but the vaccination, the experience, because one, there's human error sometimes, and that's a safety issue. And two, then we have these other experience, vaccination reactions. That's not, attributed to what's inside the vaccine itself. So now they're characterizing it, but it's been, what provokes all this and this is a newer phenomena that has basically amplified the whole viral spread of rumors that we normally see in a more contained way, as you said. And that's a big challenge for us.
Thank you. Thanks.
Maybe come back to social media shortly. But first of all, when we talk about vaccine rumours and misinformation, it's inevitable that the MMR vaccine and Andrew Wakefield's now retracted 1998 publication suggesting a link to autism will be mentioned. And I'd be really interested to hear your and Helen's thoughts on why Wakefield has been so successful at spreading his message and what we can learn from that could help us to combat vaccine hesitancy and change the way that we have conversations with those who are unsure. Helen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So thank you. And no, you can't really have this conversation without talking about the MMR, and it's probably sort of need to be careful about thinking what we can learn, because obviously there's a lot that we need to sort of make sure that we don't learn. But I think you're right. I think there are, and I think from my and from what Heidi's written in the book, it's those conversations with people and getting down to what is important to that individual. And I think it's really important that we don't belittle people's concerns and that we actually try to get down to what is it that that individual in front of you is concerned about, rather than trying to assume. One of the things that we say when we're teaching nurses around immunisation is, don't get into a lecture, because the last thing somebody wants when they come and see you is a lecture about the science. They might want some of that, but they actually want you to listen to their concerns. But I think that's a really difficult thing, particularly when you've got a very minimal amount of time for those consultations. And I think the other thing to sort of point out is, we talk about vaccine hesitancy, and I'm really cautious about using that word, because actually hesitancy is normal. And if you're recommending any sort of treatment and vaccines or anything, we would expect people to ask questions. So as the healthcare professionals, as healthcare community, but the public, we need to expect to answer those questions. And it goes down to having those individual conversations with people. I mean, there's so much that you can say, but the chapter on risk. So a lot of people will sort of say, well, I've just heard about MMR, I've heard, and, there must be something in it. And they're not necessarily sure what it is at this stage. We're sort of 20 odd years down the line, but they just know, or they've got relatives, family members who are on the spectrum, and they sort of think they've got this association in their heads. And so it is about getting down to the conversation with them about what it is that they've heard, but also what they're really concerned about. And that's where you have to frame the conversation, I think.
Yes, and there is actually a whole chapter 3 on risk. And in that chapter, Heidi writes that one of the key reasons why there'll always be vaccine rumours is that vaccines will always have risks. And even with the best scientific evidence, there'll still be uncertainty, and fertile ground for rumours will come and go. Suze, what can we learn from the examples highlighted in Stuck about the role of effective public engagement and science communication?
Yeah, I'd like to echo, first of all, what Helen has said. I think we need to understand what's important to people. But I would say that in the examples that Heidi's mentioned, as well as the very much lived example that we have all been sharing over the last 2.5 years, we can take it as an opportunity to encourage greater engagement and true dialogue about these things. I think it is so important that we try and build confidence in people asking these questions, because the last thing that we want to do is to alienate people when it comes to these huge, public health matters. I don't want to be the first one to drop in the CP Snow klaxon so early on in a conversation, but we do have these two cultures. People can be bad at art but appreciate art. People can be bad at music but listen to music. And yet we have this thing where people seem to think if they didn't engage well with science in school, or they were perceived to be bad at it, that they can't have a place in the conversation now. And that's absolutely false. Science on the whole is publicly funded, and so the public deserve to be a part of these conversations. And so I think for me, one of the things that stands out from the examples in the book that Heidi's included, as well as the examples that we continue to live through, statistical literacy, I think, seems to be a big thing. Understanding risk, understanding what it really means when you read a headline that says, doing X increases your risk of something by 50%. If that initial risk is 0.01 and it's increasing by 50%, sure, that's a flashy headline. But in real numbers, it's not a huge increase. And so I think, for me, I think these can be and should be opportunities for public engagement professionals and for researchers as well to really try and understand where the barriers are, to really seeing that we know that these people have enough skepticism within them to be stopping and saying, well, hang on a minute, I'm not sure about this vaccine. I'm not sure whether I want to be taking this. If we could somehow channel that skepticism into looking more at the scientific method that people have been exposed to within the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, and really start to ask questions about the quality, the reproducibility, the falsifiability of the information that they are looking at, rather than the research solution, then I think we would be in a good position. I do, though, have this continued bugbear where we put this on researchers a lot. And it absolutely should be part of every researcher's kind of arsenal of how they do science and communicate science. I remember Sir Mark Walport at the Science Communication Conference years ago said that science isn't finished until it's communicated, and that's absolutely true. But the problem is that I do think we work within a research culture that doesn't train, reward, or acknowledge good public engagement. We're very bad at evaluating the success of public engagement, and so we then don't know how to improve on things, how to tweak things. And so I do think sometimes we need to look at the culture that we're working within as well, to make sure that if 20% or 25% of our work is supposed to be in engaging the public with the research that we're doing, and that's policymakers, the so-called general public, which is nowhere near homogenous, all of these different groups that we should be communicating with, it shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be something that's embedded throughout the research that we're doing, and should be, I think, sort of better valued, really, because it's only when these things come up that we see the true challenges of poor public engagement. So it is, I'm going to bring it back around to a positive, it is an opportunity, and it's a good one, and we should embrace it.
Great point. Will Jennings, you've published on how trust, mistrust and distrust shape the governance of the COVID-19 crisis. And there are lots of instances in Stuck where political distrust has influenced vaccine hesitancy. Did any examples in Stuck really stand out to you in terms of that?
Yes, no, I mean, I think the couple of examples that became most prominent, and actually I think it's a sort of link, there's a sort of milieu of distrust of institutions, of expertise, or professional associations. I thought the MMR example was one that sort of comes up again and again. I think the victims' families who felt let down by the medical profession, who became distrustful, who looked towards an expert who themselves was distrustful of the medical establishment. I also thought the example that Heidi raised of in India in 2009, the H1N1 vaccines being refused by health workers due to a crisis of confidence in vaccines was really interesting and important, because I think it speaks to this point. Actually, maybe I'd kind of disagree a little bit with Suze's sort of position of being a bit too self-critical of the scientific community, because in some ways, often the stories about trust are really not so much about bad, scientific communication. Actually, I think the scientific communication during COVID was actually really good. And a lot of the problems around trust seem to relate to deeper systemic problems about institutional distrust, more generalized distrust. And so I think, the points that I think that where distrust sort of melds into rumor, disinformation, conspiracy, is that sort of ambiguity, the fact that people are struggling. And that really came across to me in the book about the fact that people are struggling with an uncertain world. And it's not to do with so much the fact that they're all tin hat wearing conspiracy theorists who think that we're ruled by lizards. It's because they have conflicting sources of information. They hear it's sort of kind of folk stories, and they have folk theories about how vaccines works, about how the virus works. And the focus group work that we did during the pandemic, during 8 countries, kind of threw this up, that actually what citizens were doing was trying to cope with this. They were skeptical. They wanted to take the vaccine, but they weren't sure. And so that confidence and trust building really is so crucial to that. And so I really love the book from that perspective, because it combined trust, rumor, risk in that really complex world in which applies both to citizens, but also actually to medical professionals as well. I think that's a really kind of great theme that comes through, and that personal stories that Heidi talked about.
Actually, Will, we are quite in agreement. I absolutely agree that the greatest thing that we can do is just really build confidence in critical thinking when it comes to the information that we receive, because it is information overload. Even in research, we're publishing research at unprecedented rates, and so to keep on top of it, and to keep on top of it meaningfully, is hard enough for researchers, let alone people out there making what could be seen to be scary decisions for them, very new decisions. So we are in agreement. You just articulate it better.
Certainly the trust issue came through very, very strongly to me in the book, and that the fact that although we think it's all about the vaccine, a lot of the time, or some of the time, it's actually not really about the vaccine. That's just a way that all the issues express themselves. Have I understood that correctly, Heidi?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and more than ever in COVID, it became a platform for all these other grievances, and more than ever, because one of the Achilles heels, as it were, of vaccination in general is that it's for the whole population. So if you want a platform, there really isn't another health intervention. I mean, water, but it's different. That is so population wide that if you want a platform, and you want to get attention, that's one, and that's why it's been more vulnerable. But with COVID, we had a much bigger population who were all of a sudden paying attention to vaccines, and a lot more opportunity for people to jump on with other issues, with the vaccine being the kind of excuse, as it were. Not to say that there aren't some concerns about vaccines specifically, but generally we find that when you really try to pin it down, most of the time it's a safety concern. And as Helen said, hesitancy is normal. It's actually a bit responsible for a first-time mother who is a bit, I want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. But, at the end of the day, she'll go for it. And anyway, I was not a big fan of the naming of vaccine hesitancy. That's why, I've gone with confidence, because I think it at least gives a more positive spin.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to give you all a challenge now. I'd like you, each of you, in a sentence or two, to sum up what you will take away from this book, or what readers could hope to take away from this book. So I shall start back with Will Irving, in a nutshell.
I think it's brought home to me what was always a fairly obvious message, but it's hammered home, is that medicine cannot be paternalistic. We cannot just simply assume that doctors know best, and that therefore everybody's going to take our advice and do what we want them to do. And if we want to succeed with new medical interventions, new drugs, new vaccines, new technologies, we do have to respect, explain ourselves, and expect and deal with respect anyone who disagrees. So I think that's, for me, the big message of the book. I don't think we can hear you, Angarad.
Now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So, Helen, what would you sum up to take away from this book?
So I think one of the key messages, and this probably relates to wider the vaccine program, is that we just need to keep up the pressure. You can't do something once and then walk away from it. And I think all of the examples that Heidi gives in the book and that we've talked about in this discussion sort of sum that up, really. So we need to keep up our ability to have those conversations with people and our ability to have that engagement with people, but we can't assume that we do it sort of once and then walk away from it. And I think that's one of the dangers almost from policy makers, is that what do we have to do? And there isn't one thing that we have to do. You just got to keep going and can't. I think we put in a blog with a colleague, can't take your foot off the pedal with this, and just sort of keep abreast of what's happening, and keep abreast of some of those things that are filtering through, whether it's, anxiety as Heidi talked about with the HPV vaccine in Japan and Denmark. But, the political discussion that was happening around COVID vaccines that fed through to wider distrust, we've got to just keep our eye on it, really, and keep up the pressure.
Thanks, Helen. And Suze.
I keep agreeing with Helen. So I will add to that, and I will say that I think my main take homes from the book are some of the case studies, because I think they remind us of the lived experiences of the publics that we are trying to engage with. It must be a dialogue, but it does remind me of the fact that anytime there is a public attitudes to science survey or a public trust in scientists survey, they tend to survey scientists as well. And for some reason, we always feel that the public trust us less than they actually trust us. I think by looking at some of these examples, it reminds us all that we don't need to be on the defensive, that actually people want to trust and want to believe. And what we need to do is find the correct context and address the exact concerns that they have, hear them and have those conversations. So rather than just saying, well, that's wrong, or no, you've not understood that, because these are intelligent people, and they're skeptical for a reason, because they feel that they can be and they should be. And so I think in order to increase confidence, we really need to understand where people are coming from. And so for me, the book is perfect for that. And even as I was reading it, it has really served as a reminder that we must contextualize and place our initial conversations so that we don't lose people, so that we take them on journeys with us as well.
Suze. And Will Jennings.
Well, at risk of repeating myself, I think for me, the real takeaway from the book is just how the challenges of vaccine hesitancy or vaccine willingness, depending on how to frame it positively, are all embedded inherently in social relations, institutional relations, expertise. And I think we can't abstract away these sorts of problems as sort of being purely expert problems. I think they have to understand the challenges in which these rumors emerge and misinformation emerges, and how everyone's struggling, both experts and citizens, to sort of come to sense with risk.
Thanks very much. Now I'm going to invite you all in the audience, if you have any questions to put to Heidi or any of our panelists, please do enter them in the Q&A. And while I give you a chance to think of your questions and put them in the Q&A, I'm going to go back to Heidi about the social media issue, which I don't feel that we've fully explored in our discussions. Obviously, in olden days, vaccine hesitancy or lack of confidence and misinformation was enabled by print press and billboards and so forth. But now we have the internet and social media. So what trends are we observing regarding that, and how can we tackle the spread of misinformation on social media? Is that even possible?
Thanks. And first, I just want to say thank you to the other panelists, because it's very moving to hear your takeaways on the book, and they're very germane to what I had been hoping to communicate. So thank you. And really the bottom line of relationship building and listening. So thank you. The social media, and I know this is a bridging thing, but just on the HPV social media issue, one of the things we found, and this is, I'll come to the more trends part, but that with these mothers, with these girls who are having this reaction, one of the problem points was that the medical professionals would just say, it's not because of the vaccine. And we would try to say, it doesn't matter. What you just have to say, I'm really sorry your daughter has these symptoms, because these symptoms are very real. So the acknowledgement that you understand that she's having a hard time, and the mother is also, already was a major, could totally change the dynamic and willingness. But on the social media front, one, you don't have always that person-to-person thing, which is challenging. The trends are pretty worrying because of the speed and pace. I think we focus a lot on the fact-checking and the misinformation. Personally, I think from the tech company side, I just want them to slow it down from the back end, rein it in. It's all going too fast, too wide. And I know that's the business model, but that would do a lot more than just trying to clip some of the misinformation off, which we need to also do. But at the same time, there's a lot more recognition of, we went through a honeymoon period, as you could call it, with the novelty of social media, and a lot of people just enjoying, thinking of it as a free speech forum, but then saw the good and the bad of that, and now are starting to rein it in and see the limits of it. So I think on the one hand, we've seen some of the worst of it, but we're also there are a lot of efforts on all sides to say, okay, we gave it free rein. We see where the limits are. We see what the harms are. We need to regulate it. We need to also, I think that the youngest generation growing up with it now is much more conscious of the risks, much more conscious than, we forget sometimes that Facebook only opened its stores in 2006, and it took a few more years for it to go to the state it is today, or Twitter, or the other, and there's multiple new ones since then. This is pretty brand new. So my positive sentiment is we're on a fast learning curve. We see the limits of it. We also have a younger generation of scientists and health professionals who are much more at ease with some of these new technologies and leaping in there in ways that there's been a bit of a gap in terms of comfort levels with these new technologies. And I've seen a lot of pretty innovative stuff going on. We did a great partnership with a group of young scientists in the UK. And then it's went to some other countries, Team Halo, I'm sure you're familiar, young scientists and who had been working on vaccine research, COVID vaccine, or working in the hospitals, who were online with TikTok, answering your questions quickly. You got to know them as people out of the hospital or out of the lab, and so there's a lot of innovation going on. So I have a lot of hope with that, but we can't let our guard down. And I think that we need to get in the youngest in schools. We got a lot of work to do, but in schools, Finland has a fantastic program on critical thinking, and they really get students to see it's not easy, but to think twice, think before you share, but in a bigger way. So I think we need to be proactive. We have an opportunity. COVID has been if we didn't see it before, it's been a huge wake-up call. The challenge right now is that by reining it in the social media platforms, it makes it look like it's gone away, and it hasn't. And I've had a lot of interactions with Facebook, and they said, look, we did this survey and there's almost nothing there. I said, yeah, that's because you took it down. It went over to that platform. And we need to look at some cross-platform, and also remember that the world is not only online. And I think that's really important, that there's some really innovative work offline. We need to surround the online space with another story.
Sure, yes. It's easy to forget that not everyone is actually on Twitter and Facebook and things. I was very interested to read what you wrote about social media savvy millennials being more skeptical than older populations, which surprised me because I would have thought that they would be better informed, but it seemed to be the opposite.
What did you? I didn't follow.
You wrote that people who were very social media savvy and younger, groups of them were more skeptical of vaccines than older people.
Yes. Well, it depends. One thing we've seen in COVID, and I wrote that before COVID, but COVID has exposed different things. Like in Asia, we saw far more pockets of elderly refusing vaccines. I mean, you've seen the news on Hong Kong. I think it was 66% of over 80s absolutely refused the vaccine. So the reality is that we haven't really paid enough attention to adult vaccination. And one of the things we started to do a lot more work in before COVID was vaccines for life, and really looking at it. And we had picked, pediatric vaccines, HPV, vaccines for pregnancy and flu as just kind of vaccines that were part of and there's a lot more populating that. But I think COVID has helped us pull along the recognition that we really need this lifelong look at this.
We have a question from the audience. Somebody asking, what differences do we see between the way rumours spread in higher or lower income countries?
One thing that I am struck by in Africa, for instance, is there's a lot of bad stuff out there in Europe and the US, but somehow there's a lot of other information that, if you're not fully critical and you're gobbling up the negative stuff, if you're in that middle spectrum where you're open, you can also get good information. One of the challenges in Africa, for instance, is we've seen like one bad WhatsApp. I mean, bad in terms of very negative or harmful post about a vaccine. It can go viral like and have massive effects. We saw in Pakistan too, picking up on what was going on with HPV in girls. Someone was doing like a mimic of that with young boys in a polio vaccination effort, and did this little YouTube quick film, or just a film on the phone, that sent it around, and you could almost see that they were faking the fainting. But 70,000 people wouldn't let their kids get vaccinated because they got scared that the kids were going to be poisoned or whatever. And you don't see these kind of, and we saw in two examples, and some of this is in the book, in 2 states, the anxieties about a monkeypox vaccine, which we have more information on these days, and a plague vaccine. They were coming and forcing children, and it had to shut down the school because the teachers were getting attacked and the army were going to come in. And I mean, what I see the difference is the explosive drama in quick time in some of these settings that you can get bad. There's a lot of similar types of things. I'm not saying at all that, higher income countries are immune to having this kind, but it's in an environment where there's a lot more information to counter and mitigate that going as quickly viral. So that's a challenge. And I think that will hopefully evolve, but I think it's something that we need more training in for health officials to be kind of prepared for these kind of reactions, because it's really, and in one of these cases, it had a huge impact on schooling. And it was a vaccine rumor.
Yeah, so the sort of the consequences that you might not immediately even think of. I'm afraid that time is nearly up. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, really. And thank you so much, Heidi, for joining us, and also to our brilliant panelists who all brought their own insights and really brought the topic alive. And also thank you very much to everyone in our audience for joining us tonight. After we close the session, the RCPath team will be sending around a short feedback survey, and we'd love to know what you thought of tonight's event if you could find time to fill that in. There's still time to take part in our other National Pathology Week events and activities. There's still a few that are still to run. Please have a look at our website and register. So tomorrow we have a virtual pub quiz for veterinary undergraduates. The medical student one has been earlier in the week, but it's the veterinary undergraduates tomorrow. And on Saturday at 11 o'clock, we have a family pathology-inspired origami workshop with Dr. Lizzie Burns. The recording from all the events from earlier this week will be available to view on our YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks, and that includes Monday's panel discussion on the past, present and future of pathology, and Tuesday's foundation lecture by Professor Sir Jonathan Van Tam. So that's all for tonight. Thank you very much again, everyone, Heidi and all the panelists, for joining us and for your brilliant discussion. Thanks everyone, and have a fantastic rest of National Pathology Week. Goodbye. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.